Atheists and skeptics of Christianity often portray themselves as champions of reason, standing against a sea of irrationality. But what if the existence of reason itself undercut the credibility of the atheist position? That was C.S. Lewis's argument in his book Miracles, in which he claimed a fundamental incompatibility between the atheist materialist worldview and the very existence of rational inference itself. This has come to be known as Lewis's argument from reason against naturalism, and we're going to discuss it. So what is the first premise of the argument?
Written in historical records, documented in Tacitus and Josephus. For those who don't believe us, check the marks of architecture written on a fetus. Neural nets and error correcting codes complete us.
Chaos theory.
Reality.
So the first premise is that we can actually perform rational inference. I think we all agree on that. So in other words, if P implies Q, and I know that it's true that P holds, then I know as a fact that Q holds. So from the truth of two things, I infer the truth of the other. Christians, theists, and atheists, we all agree that we can perform rational inference. Even naturalists would agree with this. So what is a naturalist? C.S. Lewis defined a naturalist in this way. So he said in the second chapter of Miracles, entitled The Naturalist and the Supernaturalist, that some people believe that nothing exists except nature. I call these people naturalist. So in other words, we would typically refer to them as materialist or sometimes atheistic materialist. They believe that matter and energy and things in motion, the things that we could see, touch, and measure, those are the only things that exist. There doesn't exist anything beyond what we would think of as nature. So again, even within this atheistic, naturalistic, materialistic worldview, we all agree that we can perform rational inference. If you don't believe that, you could stop watching the video because I'm going to try to make an argument. And if you don't believe that we could actually make arguments and that you could arrive at a position through rational inference, then there's really no point in finishing the video. Premise number 2. No belief is rationally inferred if it could be fully explained as the result of non-rational causes. So what do I mean by this? I mean that if I can find some motivating factor for your belief that doesn't involve truth or reason, that would seem to discredit your belief. Or at least that's how we act in our society. So for example, Naomi Oreskes, she has a book, Merchants of Doubt, in which she tries to portray those who would question the consensus climate change narrative as having ulterior motives, right? Maybe they're in the pocket of big oil, maybe there's other motivating factors. So the underlying premise there is that if we can find motivating factors that are unrelated to rationality, that would undercut their position. So if we can find that they came to their belief as a result of non-rational causes rather than through rational inference. Atheists themselves will often accuse Christians as believing in God and the afterlife only out of fear. So what is the underlying premise there? Well, it's again that there is a non-rational cause for the belief that God exists or that we have an afterlife. And so the atheist position is fundamentally trying to argue that if we can find such a causal connection between fear and the belief, then that would discredit the belief. Again, the underlying assumption is that if it could be shown that the reason why you're proclaiming a particular statement or belief is because of these non-rational factors in your life, because of your identity, etc., then that would discredit your belief. That's how people use that argument. And I think as a society, we seem to accept that. At least that's how we behave. Okay, so third premise is that having a mechanistic causal explanation for a phenomenon displaces other contenders for its explanation. So a causal mechanistic explanation means that you understand how something works in terms of the underlying physics, chemistry, biology, etc. So for example, if there was someone with a disease and we thought that they got the disease because someone looked at them with the evil eye, we would no longer believe that once we learned about germ theory, once we had a mechanistic explanation for their disease, or somebody who had a heart attack, right? If we found out that it wasn't because somebody put a curse on them, but it was because they had really bad hypertension, that would seem to displace the curse explanation. Volcanic eruptions, if we see those as the result of seismic activity rather than the anger or wrath of the gods. And lastly, even skeptics will accuse Christians of using God of the gaps reasoning, where somebody would insert belief in God or God as an explanation where we lack information. All of these are working under the assumption that having a mechanistic causal explanation for a phenomenon would displace any other contenders for that phenomenon, right, for its explanation. So I'm going to use a phrase, not naturalism as C.S. Lewis does, but materialism. And so this follows from Victor Reppert's book, C.S. Lewis's Dangerous Idea, in which he presents a form of the argument from reason. Okay, so following Reppert, materialism proposes the following. So number one is the mechanism thesis. And to quote Reppert, the physical level is to be understood mechanistically, such that purposive explanations must be further explained in terms of a non-purposive substratum. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that we have to understand things that happen at the physical level based on mechanistic things that happen underneath it. So in other words, biology is the result of chemistry and physics. And physics itself is the result of the laws of the universe. So you have this hierarchical building of explanations, but at the core level, it's just matter in motion. Okay, that's the mechanism thesis. Second is the causal closure thesis, which states, the physical order is causally closed. No non-physical causes operate at the physical level. The physical level is a comprehensive system of events that's not affected by anything that is not itself physical. So in other words, we don't have supernatural interventions in nature. Everything that happens is the result of physical interactions, causes that operate at the physical level. Okay, that is the materialist causal closure thesis. And then third, we have the Supervenience Thesis, which is, to quote Reppert, that other states, such as mental states, if they exist, supervene on physical states. Given the state of the physical, there is only one way the mental, for example, can be. And so this is the argument or the belief that everything is the result of physics, essentially, when you boil it down. So mental states, if they exist, they're the result of brain states. They're not the result of some immaterial mind. So that's the materialist view that I'm going to argue against. So let's talk about Lewis's argument in terms of two different types of explanations. So Lewis argues in Miracles that there are ground-consequent explanations and causal explanations. And these are two distinct things. So according to Lewis, there are two types of connection. There is connection by cause and effect, and connection by ground and consequent. So what is cause and effect? Here's an example of cause and effect connection. The light is on because the light switch is in the on position. So the light switch being in the on position causes the light bulb to be on. Okay, so notice we use the word because, but we could also use the word because in a different way. So in ground and consequent reasoning, we would say the light switch is in the on position because the light is on. But notice the light being on didn't cause, in a causal mechanistic sense, the light switch to be on. But it is the explanation for the light switch being on. Because we see that the light bulb is on, then we know that the light switch must be on. So this is ground consequent reasoning. And notice that it is temporally backward. So the light switch coming on first makes the light bulb come on. But in ground consequent reasoning, it could be in the opposite direction. That we argue that because the light bulb is on, the light switch is on. So what this means is that logical implication is not physical causation. I'm going to say that again. Logical implication is not physical causation because temporally it could be backwards. And we all know this. Baseless claims and ungrounded accusations are caused, but they are not logically implied. Lewis gives some examples in Miracles. He says, grandfather is ill today because he ate lobster yesterday. So this is cause and effect. And then he also gives this example. Grandfather is ill today because he hasn't gotten up yet, and we know he is an invariably early riser when he is well. And that is ground consequent reasoning. Lewis continues, the old man's late rising is not the cause of his disorder, but the reason why we believe him to be disordered. There is a similar difference between he cried out because it hurt him, which is cause and effect, and it must have hurt him because he cried out, ground and consequent. The one indicates a dynamic connection between events or states of affairs. the other a logical relation between beliefs or assertions. Reppert expounds on this as well. While every event in nature must be related to one or another by cause and effect, the premises in a rational inference must be related to the conclusion by the ground and consequent relationship. Lewis in Miracle says, even if grounds do exist, what have they got to do with the actual occurrence of belief as a psychological event? If it is an event, it must be caused. It must, in fact, be simply one link in a causal chain which stretches back to the beginning and forward to the end of time. How could such a trifle as lack of logical grounds prevent the belief's occurrence? And how could the existence of grounds promote it? Okay, so this reminds me of a story that I once heard, which is somebody was trying to explain to their friend how to boil a kettle of water. And they said, okay, you need to be at sea level. You need to put water inside of the pot. You need to raise the temperature to 100 degrees Celsius. And then you need to add a gnome. And his friend said, oh, I did all those steps except I forgot to add the gnome. And his friend said, oh yeah, you don't need to worry about that step. That step isn't important. Okay, so that is essentially the argument Lewis is making here, that if everything is just cause and effect, then it doesn't matter if you actually have logical grounds or not, because that same belief is going to arise just from the cause and effect. How could such a trifle as having an actual logical grounds for something promote that belief or work against it, right? How could it prevent the belief's occurrence, and how could it promote it? Reppert again. In rational inference, what we know is a logical connection, and a logical connection is not in any particular spatiotemporal location. So in other words, logical relations are not located at a particular place at a particular time. Logic relations existed before humans, and specifically before human brains. So if you think about Big Bang cosmology and the law of non-contradiction, if cosmic inflation actually happened, then it is not the case that it also did not happen. And that was true at the time when the universe was formed, right? Before there were any human minds around. So the laws of logic relation are not dependent solely on human brains, because they exist independently of human brains. They exist even if there was a universe that didn't have any matter in it and any human minds in it. Ed Fesser makes this point in his book, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God, in which he says, imagine the proposition, there is no matter or human minds. Okay? So in a universe that had neither matter nor human minds, that proposition would be true. But notice the truth of that proposition cannot depend on either material matter or human minds, right? Because it's true in a universe without either of those things. And so what does this mean? It means that logical relations are not simply reducible to brain states. So I've been making an argument based on the works of Lewis and Reppert to try to convince you of a point, or several points at this point. But notice that I'm trying to do convincing. And so Reppert leans into this. He says, any adequate account of the relation between reasons and causes must provide an account of the role that convincing plays in our cognitive economy. If reasons cannot be part of the explanation of how we come to hold beliefs as a matter of personal history, then human rationality as we understand it simply does not exist. So the very fact that as an atheist, as a materialist, you try to convince people, that would argue against your position. Because unless you see yourself as just physics hacking, if you think that they could actually come to a belief based on logical reasoning, based on truth, that rests on the assumption that people can be convinced based on truth and reasons, not just based on cause and effect. So the very fact that as an atheist or a materialist, you want to convince people of the truth of your position would seem to argue against your position. Because under the atheist materialist view of the world, the only thing that exists is matter in motion, energy in motion. And so for me to arrive at any belief, I'm going to arrive at it because of cause and effect, not because of the truth and the logical relations of the things you are presenting to me. Okay? So in the Naomi Oreskes view of the world, I'm only arriving at my beliefs because of non-rational causes. I'm not arriving at my beliefs because of the truth of a premise and what follows from it. So let's review the argument. So here are the premises. No belief is rationally inferred if it can be fully explained in terms of non-rational causes. If materialism is true, then all beliefs can be fully explained in terms of non-rational causes. Therefore, if materialism is true, then no belief is rationally inferred. If any thesis entails the conclusion that no belief is rationally inferred, then it should be rejected and its denial accepted. Therefore, materialism should be rejected and its denial accepted. So if your view of the world, if your philosophy forces us to the position that there is no such thing as true rational inference, then we have to reject your view of the world. That is Reppert's argument. Lewis expounds on this in Miracles. He says, all possible knowledge, then, depends on the validity of reasoning. If the feeling of certainty which we express by words like must be and therefore and since is a real perception of how things outside our own minds really must be, well and good. But if this certainty is merely a feeling in our own minds and not a genuine insight into realities beyond them, if it merely represents the way our minds happen to work, then we can have no knowledge. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. It follows that no account of the universe can be true unless the account leaves it possible for our thinking to be a real insight. A theory which explained everything else in the whole universe, but which made it impossible to believe that our thinking was valid, would be utterly out of court. For that theory would itself have been reached by thinking, and if thinking is not valid, that theory would, of course, be itself demolished. It would have destroyed its own credentials. It would be an argument which proved that no argument was sound, a proof that there are no such things as proofs, which is nonsense. Lewis also says, it is by inferences that we build up the idea of nature at all. So in other words, the atheist materialist view of nature, you had to arrive at that by inference, by logic, right? And so if you arrive at a position which undercuts the validity of logic itself, which says that all of our beliefs are simply the results of chemistry and physics, they don't rely on rational grounds and consequent reasoning, they only rely on cause and effect reasoning, then that undercuts the credibility of the position you're putting forward. It would be, to borrow Lewis's words, as if you're arguing that you have a proof that there are no proofs. So in other words, that you have thought through and arrived at the position that there is no such thing as thinking. So not everyone agrees with this argument, and there have been critiques of it, which I'm going to address some of them right now. So one of the earliest arguments against Lewis's position was by Elizabeth Anscombe, who was a philosopher contemporaneous with C.S. Lewis. And Anscombe took Lewis to task because he used the phrase irrational causes rather than non-rational causes in an earlier account. And so in other words, he argued that if you arrive at a belief based only on irrational causes, then that belief cannot be valid. And what Anscombe, I think, rightly argued was that there is a difference between something being irrational and simply non-rational. And Lewis concedes the point and shows that his argument still works, right? And so he updated his argument to use the phrase non-rational causes rather than irrational. There's another critique, which is that there could be a compatibility of different levels of explanation. And this is due to Anscombe and Bever-Sluys. So for example, if there is a Coke can that is resting on the shelf, I could say that there are different reasons for it being on the shelf. It's on the shelf because of gravity. Gravity currently holds it to the shelf. It could be because of my desire. I wanted to place it on the shelf. It could be because no one has knocked it over. It could be because it has a cylindrical shape and so it's supported by the table and it doesn't roll over, etc. So there are many different levels of explanation for why the Coke can is on the shelf. However, there is the principle of explanatory exclusion. So if we explain a man's death as the result of a heart attack, then we are not simultaneously explaining it as the result of a voodoo curse in the materialist worldview, right? They would see those explanations, one of them displacing the other. So the mechanistic cause and effect relation is sufficient to bring about the belief. But under materialism, the grounds-consequent relation still needs the underlying cause and effect relation to bring about the belief. So in other words, the grounds-consequent relation depends on the cause and effect relation for bringing about the belief. They see it, the grounds-consequent, as supervening on the true cause and effect reason for that belief. And furthermore, we have the causal closure thesis, which means that there are no non-physical causes. Everything is physics. Everything is matter in motion, energy in motion. So some of you may be bristling in your seat thinking about, but what about evolution, right? So there are evolutionary considerations to take into account. So assuming that collections of matter arose that would assess the truth and falsity of propositions, represent true propositions, and act on grounds-consequent relations, we can imagine that true beliefs might be more reproductively advantageous than false beliefs. So natural selection would tend to preserve such collections of matter. So in other words, if these collections of matter were better at arriving at truth, then those would be preserved, and therefore we should expect that human reasoning works. That is the crude kind of summarization of this argument. So according to Johnson, 2008, reasoning abilities are an evolutionary side effect, a spandrel of things like more complex brains. He sees it as nearly inevitable that humans would eventually get bigger brains that could process truth as the result of preserved replication errors. So in other words, randomized variation. He argues that evolutionary processes are not truly random, but its outcomes are highly likely. Therefore, since physical-only brains that can access grounds-consequent truths would be beneficial, they are highly likely to have arisen naturally. There is just one problem with this view. It sounds good, but there's a problem, which is that if we optimize for fitness, we're not necessarily optimizing for truth. So Prakash et al. In 2021 wrote a paper in Acta Biotheoretica, which is Fitness Beats Truth in the Evolution of Perception, in which they state, the fitness beats truth theorem therefore strongly calls into question the standard view that more accurate precepts are fitter, and hence that natural selection evolves perceptual systems to have more and more vertical precepts. So in other words, that natural selection will evolve systems like our brains that will have more and more true propositions or be better and better able to assess truth. They're calling into question that with the theorem they've proven. So from the abstract, more precisely, the FBT theorem provides a quantitative measure of the extent to which the fitness-only strategy dominates the truth strategy and of how this dominance increases with the size of the perceptual space. Reppert also talks about this. He says, our faculties must be reliable indicators not merely of what will be conducive to survival, but of what is true, right? And we have examples, things such as logical fallacies. So for example, affirming the consequent, or the idea that if someone wears red, they're a communist, right? Those are subject to the same selection pressures. They are preserved, yet they are not just non-rational, they are irrational. So in other words, selection pressure itself doesn't guarantee truth. It doesn't necessarily move our brain systems towards being able to assess truth, being able to do true rational inference. You can have cause and effect brain sequences that look like rational inference, but they're still irrational. And to me, this is a kind of weak way of arguing. It is a selection of the gaps, to do a wordplay on God of the gaps, right? So for example, imagine that you have a tribe of nomads in the desert that are fed by manna, by bread from heaven, right? Notice that having manna would be selectively advantageous. It would give you a selection advantage. However, natural selection doesn't explain the appearance of manna. To the extent that manna exists, it's not explained by the fact that it's useful for that tribe, okay? Or take, for example, if someone had a robotic arm and they go into a local bar, right? They're not a scientist, they just have a robotic arm, and their friend sees them and says, how the heck did you get a robotic arm? If their answer is, well, it is useful, it is beneficial, that doesn't explain how they got the robotic arm. That explains why they would keep a robotic arm if they ever came across it, but it wouldn't explain how they obtained the robotic arm in the first place. Notice, natural selection lacks foresight. It cannot select on the basis of future potential. It cannot select on the basis of future utility, right? So to say, oh, natural selection will produce brains that are able to do rational inference and assess truth rightly, because it will eventually be useful, that's not an explanation. That doesn't explain the appearance of such brains. It explains how if we got such brains, we would spread them in the population. They would be preserved in the population because they give us an advantage. It doesn't necessarily explain how they would arise in the population in the first place, okay? Utility could explain why your friend might endeavor to design and create a robotic arm were he to have the requisite knowledge, materials, and skill. But building a robotic arm requires one to imagine, desire, design, and act. The mental explanation for the robotic arm requires imagination, thoughts about things, and volition, thoughts bringing about things, both powers which natural selection lacks. So C.S. Lewis's argument from reason against naturalism, viewed through the lens of Reppert's presentation of it, gives us both an argument and a mystery. And we see that Jesus' parables often had two roles, as an argument against the thinking of Pharisees and Sadducees, and as a mystery to be meditated upon and revealed by those with ears to hear. The argument from reason presents both. It's an argument against crass, flatland materialism and an invitation into a deep mystery.
Theos theory.